Taking a Stand in History, Standing Up for Slaves' Rights Outside of the Civil War, by Bethany and Elijah Williams. Introduction.
America, a land of freedom. Yet that freedom was not immediately apparent. Between 1619 and the end of the Civil War, the land of the free had slaves. Slavery was most prominent in the South. Southerners relied on slaves in their daily life, economically and socially. Cotton plantations, the backbone of the Southern economy, relied solely on slaves. In addition to this, slaves were viewed as an equalizer of white men. The lowest white peasant could consider himself higher in society than a slave. The South would become so totally reliant on this institution that they wouldn't give it up until after the Civil War. That's not to say that nobody tried.
Section 1. Political Fighting. Like any war, the Civil War did not just happen instantaneously. It had a lot of political buildup that motivated them to fight each other. People from the North and South fought for or against slavery politically, using speeches, writings, or other forms of communication. This led to a buildup of tension that was released violently during the bloodiest war in American history.
Abolitionists were not the only anti-slavery political group, but they were the most important. They are distinguished from other groups by their desire to totally eliminate both slavery and African American inequality. The abolitionist movement started much earlier than popular belief. In 1619, slaves arrived to North America in Jamestown, Virginia. The continent began trading with Britain for more slaves in 1636. However, even then, people had qualms about slavery. Even this early on, the lines between the North and the South had already begun to form, as different geographies caused different economies and needs. Northern states Delaware, Virginia, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania all banned slavery between 1776 and 1778 because their economies did not rely on them. The South relied on agricultural products, especially cotton, so they needed the slaves to do all their work for them.
Even before the North had the stroke of genius necessary to ban slavery, abolitionists were working to remove it. In the 1720s, Benjamin Lay, a short Quaker who hated slavery, began work to end the horror. He used wild show techniques to demonstrate the severe suffering of slaves. Once, he removed his boot and sock and stuck it into the snow, while his other foot remained in the warmth and safety inside his home. He did this to demonstrate the pain felt by slaves who lacked adequate clothing, and to freeze his foot. Another time, he temporarily kidnapped another settler's child to show the pain of a slave's broken family. I'm sure his fellow Quakers were very pleased with this stunt. His only true success during his lifetime was when the city council decided to ban all slave owners from voting.
Another abolitionist who lived before the 1800s was Anthony Benezet. He was yet another Quaker who was motivated by his religion to write against slavery, starting in 1754. One of his main ideals was education for all children, regardless of color. These ideals led him to teach many African American students. Benezet was also the founder of the first abolitionist group, the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage. Gotta love his catchy group titles. At least the members knew exactly what they were getting into.
Benjamin Rush was a respected doctor who signed the Declaration of Independence. Oh, by the way, we're jumping in a few years later. He spent some time studying the physical anatomy of whites and African Americans, finding that they were the same. This led him to denounce slavery on a scientific ground. Anthony Benezet was a colleague of his who prompted him to write an anti-slavery article that he accurately titled An Address to the Inhabitants of the British Settlements in America Upon Slavekeeping. Apparently complicated names was the trend back then. His selling point was that African Americans had equal amounts of brain power as whites, which meant they were equals. When the rebellion came, he stuck with his views on slavery, that it should not be allowed in the new republic.
Moses Brown came from a line of slave traders. He owned the business and was running it successfully, until a slave ship accident drowned over 200 of his slaves in 1774. Guilt plagued him after this event until he eventually became an abolitionist. As an abolitionist, he ended his slave trade and freed all of his personal slaves. In addition to this, he found others with the same cause and gave as much money and time as he possibly could.
Elizabeth Freeman, known as Bet, was an abolitionist in the court of law. Born a slave, she was later mistreated by her masters. She contacted an abolitionist lawyer, Theodore Sedgwick, who agreed to help her sue her masters for emancipation. The pair won the case, an impressive feat considering she was both a woman and an African-American slave. Sedgwick pulled it off, citing a law from the Massachusetts Constitution, stating that all citizens were born equal. In 1781, the court ruled in their favor, also granting Bet 30 shillings in damage. The master couldn't have been happy.
Olaudah Equiano was born in 1745 in Nigeria. As a teenager, he was kidnapped and forced into slavery. He traveled through the infamous Middle Passage and was handed from master to master for several years. In 1766, at 21 years old, he bought his freedom. He started work with the abolitionist group the Sons of Africa, a group of African-American abolitionist Londoners. In 1789, he created his greatest work for the abolitionist movement, the autobiography, The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Equiano. Finally, an easy title. He hoped this autobiography would move others to fight against slavery.
In the year 1818, before the abolitionist movement gained any real momentum, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey was born a slave at the end of winter in Tuckahoe, Maryland. He is important. We'll explain why later.
Anyways, the Missouri Compromise was passed in the year 1820. This was a victory for anti-slave groups, but fell short of abolitionist goals. Basically, a line was drawn at 36 degrees 30 minutes. Any states above the line would be slave-free, any below would have slaves. In addition to this, slave and slave-free states had to be admitted in pairs. You know, the whole power balance thing had to stay in check.
In 1829, the abolitionist movement took a darker turn. David Walker of New England encouraged slaves, especially in Boston, to fight back against their masters. This appeal was titled Appeal in 4 articles, together with a preamble to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular, and very expressly, to those of the United States of America, written in Boston, State of Massachusetts, September 28, 1829, 3rd and last edition, with additional notes, corrections, etc. There goes another one of those names. In this article, Walker called for slaves to use violence to throw off their masters. He said, quote,
"They want us for their slaves and think nothing of murdering us in order to subject us to that wretched condition. Therefore, if there's an attempt made by us, kill or be killed. Now, I ask you, had you not rather be killed than to be a slave to a tyrant who takes the life of your mother, wife, and dear little children? Look upon your mother, wife, and children, and answer God Almighty, and believe this, that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty. In fact, the man who will stand still and let another murder him is worse than an infidel, and if he has common sense, ought not to be pitied."
End quote. His work inspired a few minor rebellions, but luckily nothing serious.
The abolitionist movement is considered to have officially started in the year 1830. It was inspired by the Second Great Awakening, a religious revival that stretched across the American continent. Abolitionists were different from other anti-slavery political parties. They wanted the total destruction of the slavery institution. The movement wouldn't last longer than 40 years.
In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison became one of the earliest abolitionist leaders by publishing The Liberator, a newspaper designed to fight for slave rights. Garrison himself used to be a supporter of slavery. However, he changed his viewpoint when he saw the suffering of slaves. In December 1833, Garrison organized a convention of all races and genders. They met in Philadelphia, where they formed the American Anti-Slavery Society, though Garrison considered it a national effort. The name kind of threw people off, though. The AAS supported non-violence and pushed for equal rights for freed slaves. By 1835, the movement had gained support from many free African Americans, aided by the Liberator raising awareness. The movement grew. Eventually, they created the Declaration of Anti-Slavery. Hopefully, their opponents know what it's for.
In the year 1837, anti-abolitionists, notice the anti, became much more aggressive. They murdered the abolitionist editor, Elijah Lovejoy. In addition to this, they burned anti-slavery literature, such as anti-slavery newspapers. Sound familiar? They also pushed for a law that disallowed any person in the U.S. House of Representatives to even consider any abolitionist laws. While this severely limited abolitionist power, kind of like taking someone's sword away in a sword fight, in an ironic twist, it caused more people to begin to vote for abolitionists out of pity for Eliza Lovejoy and fear for their own rights, kind of like tossing him a bigger, better sword. This opposition continued until the end of the movement.
Frederick Douglass, otherwise known as Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, began life as the property of Hugh Auld. Hugh's wife taught Douglass to read and write. This ability led to his hatred of slavery. He fled captivity on September 3, 1838, dressed as a sailor with a forged ID. On September 15th, just 12 days after escaping, Douglass married Anna Murray. This event and his hatred of slavery motivated him to speak out. But hold that thought. We'll come back to it.
In the year 1840, Garrison's, remember him, the editor of The Liberator? Bold position split the party. He took part of the movement on religious grounds. These beliefs led him to advocate women's rights as well. Because of this, the party split into two, with Garrison heading up the American Anti-Slavery Party and the Tappan family leading the extremely different American and Foreign Anti-Slavery Party. Notice the foreign in society? Super different.
In the year 1845, Frederick Douglass published his first, but nowhere near last, autobiography, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. You too, Douglass? However, he was forced to hide in Ireland. As he stated in the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, one of his later autobiographies, quote, "I became myself painfully alive with the liability which surrounded me, and which might at any moment scatter all my proud hopes and return me to a doom worse than death." End quote. The danger that surrounded him was pursuit from his old masters. On August 16, 1845, Douglass fled to Ireland, where he hid for 2 years until English supporters bought his freedom so that he could return to America safely. In 1847, directly after his return, Douglass began printing political papers. Without any sort of repetition, he named his papers The North Star, Frederick Douglass Weekly, Frederick Douglass Paper, Douglass Monthly, and New National Era. He wrote these two, quote from the Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, quote, "My plans for future usefulness were all settled, and in imagination I already saw myself wielding my pen, as well as my voice, in the great work of renovating the public mind, and building up a public sentiment, which should send slavery to the grave, and restore to liberty and the pursuit of happiness the people with whom I had suffered." End quote. He did much more than write newspapers, but we'll return to that later.
In the year 1848, the abolitionist movement showed no signs of stopping. Garrison's idea of tying the women's rights movement to the abolitionist movement cottoned on. The Seneca Falls Convention met with the goal of advocating women's and slaves' rights, and contained many important people, such as Frederick Douglass and William Garrison. This convention linked the women's rights and slaves' rights movements together permanently, especially in Southern minds.
In 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, one of the few things with a reasonable title. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote this fictional novel based off the experiences of former slave Josiah Henson. This was one of the only ways to learn about the true horrors of slavery. The South, which held to the illusion that slavery was a happy arrangement, banned the book. It was a bestseller in the North, and readers of the book often joined the abolitionist movement.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act was considered a failure for both abolitionists and anti-abolitionists. Created in 1854, this act championed popular sovereignty, the belief that new territories should get to vote on whether or not they would be free or slave states. Both abolitionists and slaveholders settled there en masse in order to gain supremacy in the vote. They often used violence to drive opponents out, something we'll touch on in more detail later.
In 1855, Frederick Douglass published My Bondage and My Freedom, a reflective political book against slavery. That's 2 autobiographies so far. Then there was a short span of him just writing. We'll show what that is later.
In 1856, pro-slavery advocates attacked the Kansas town of Lawrence. Their idea was to drive out abolitionists. Kansas was gaining a bloody reputation.
In 1856, as a response to the Lawrence invasion, the Underground Railroad leader John Brown gathered a group of abolitionists, including his sons, to strike back. His group ended up killing 5 pro-slavery advocates. Because of this event, Kansas earned the nickname Bleeding Kansas. The location of this attack Pottawatomie Creek was remembered for many years afterwards. John Brown escaped unharmed.
In 1857, the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court rendered the Missouri Parallel useless. Scott claimed that because he lived above the Missouri Compromise Parallel for several years while his masters were traveling, he was a free man. He was joined in his battle for freedom by his wife. However, the Supreme Court decided that a slave could not escape to freedom beyond the Missouri Parallel, rendering that compromise void and unconstitutional. This guaranteed all states a right to own slaves, a serious blow for the abolitionist cause. Dred Scott and his wife bitterly returned to slavery.
On October 16, 1859, John Brown, with 5 African American helpers and 16 white abolitionists, several of which were his sons, attacked the U.S. Arsenal, Harper's Ferry. Unlike Bleeding Kansas, this act was unsuccessful. The U.S. military reacted swiftly and harshly, killing several of his followers and capturing Brown. He was later hung for his crimes.
In the year 1860, after John Brown's violence, the Dred Scott decision, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the abolitionist movement lost momentum. Unable to carry itself forward, the abolitionists reluctantly supported the more mild Republicans. The Republicans were free soilists, who believed that slavery should be contained to the southern states, not destroyed. The Republican Party's presidential candidate, Abraham Lincoln, sound familiar? Ended up winning the presidency, just in time for the Civil War. Partway through the Civil War, he became an abolitionist, a massive victory for the party.
Even after slavery was abolished, Douglass continued to work for African American equality. In the year 1892, he published his third autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which we quoted earlier. He died February 20th, 1895 in Washington, D.C., just 3 years after publishing his third autobiography. The Underground Railroad.
Time skipped back a bit to the year 1830 when the Abolitionist Party was first forming. The Underground Railroad was formed. The Underground Railroad was a more immediate form of fighting slavery, an escape system meant for the assistance of fugitive slaves. The Underground Railroad had some special codes so that slaves could converse without their master's knowledge, secret agent style. The Underground Railroad was actually the code for the entire system. Those who ran the system were known as conductors, taking the cargo, slaves, down lines or individual routes. They would stop at stations, safe houses, or resting places that were identifiable by lanterns hanging outside. At the stations, they were helped by stockholders, who would give the fugitives supplies for the road. While the official creation date was 1830, it was technically created in 1780 by, guess what, more Quakers who helped George Washington's slave escape. The Underground Railroad was forced to end in the year 1862 at the start of the Civil War.
There were many major conductors, including John Parker, a former slave. He transported slaves across the Ohio River, which became the Ohio River Line. He offered his house as a station as well. This guy was invested in the railroad industry.
Reverend John Rankin was another major conductor, along with John Parker's neighbor. Apparently he rubbed off on him. He helped Parker run his line of the Underground Railroad, and offered his house up as another station. One wonders how helpful that was, considering he was Parker's neighbor.
Jonathan Walker was a unique conductor. Not only did he run trains, he was also a sailor. He would attempt to free the slaves with water lines, sailing them out of the country. He was eventually caught off the shores of Florida while trying to take slaves to the Bahamas. He was arrested, imprisoned, and branded with the letters SS for slave stealer. They should have added another S for super slave stealer.
William Still was another conductor/abolitionist. He wrote The Underground Railroad, a record of facts, authentic, narratives, letters, ... Thanks, Still, another great title. He also helped Harriet Tubman during some of her many missions.
Harriet Tubman was a civil rights activist who was previously a slave. She was born somewhere between 1820 and 1825 in Dorchester County, Maryland. Her mother was Harriet Ritt Green, who was owned by Mary Patterson Broadus. Her father was Ben Ross, who was owned by Anthony Thompson, who married Broadus. When Tubman was born, she was called Arminta Minty Harriet Ross. She was one of 9 children. I'm sure their masters were happy. Little did they know the trouble she would cause them.
Eventually, Minty married John Tubman, and changed her name to Harriet. Harriet got sick, then her owner died. Backwards, isn't it? Prompting her to escape to Philadelphia in the year 1849. She began the journey with two of her brothers, but they had second thoughts and returned home. She decided to return to the South and return some of her fellow slaves to safety. When her trip was successful, she continued to return and lead more slaves to safety. She did this through the Underground Railroad. If a slave ever got cold feet, she would pull out a gun and say, "You can either become a freeman or die a slave." Darker than you might expect.
When the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1850, Harriet Tubman rerouted a line in the Underground Railroad to go to Canada. As time wore on, she occasionally had hallucinations, brought on from the aforementioned sickness. She claimed that these hallucinations were visions. She died March 10th in the year 1913 in Auburn, New York. Over the course of her life, she helped hundreds of slaves escape and never lost one, partly because of the gun tactic, earning her the nickname Moses and General Tubman.
There was a lot of danger during the slaves' bid for freedom through the railroad, starting with the high risk of death. Death could be caused by many things, including people. Slave owners hired people to pursue them and return their slaves, causing the slaves to have to travel long distances on foot without time to gather food. Slave owners also posted reward posters for fugitive slaves, Western style.
The Fugitive Slave Act, passed in the year 1850, caused problems for slaves because it encouraged the capture of slaves in the North. It also outlawed the assistance of fugitive slaves, making it more difficult for conductors to reach stockholders. Slave trains had to flee the U.S. in order to be truly safe.
Nature added to the dangers that fugitive slaves had to face. During their journeys, wild animals would attack, hunted by humans and animals, not a great situation. They had to cross treacherous terrain and face severe temperatures, all with limited supplies. Not a great deal for them.
If caught, the slaves faced serious punishment. They could be flogged, branded, jailed, sold back into slavery, or killed. Not being caught meant either freedom or death by the elements. The odds were stacked against the slaves, but they prevailed.
The Underground Railroad had many lines. Because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they all had to lead outside of the U.S. Before, they had simply led to the North. Being a conductor took on a lot more meaning after 1850.
Conclusion.
Slavery was extremely important in the South. The Southern economy relied heavily on cotton, and slaves made the majority of the workforce to collect this agricultural resource. Because it was so important, they refused to let their slaves go. In response to this philosophy, abolitionists arose. They believed that slavery should be destroyed. Non-abolitionists joined the fight in a more moderate manner, resulting in the Republican Party presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln to be elected. Conductors ran the Underground Railroad, an immediate form of salvation from slavery for African Americans. There were many influential conductors, including John Parker and Reverend John Rankin, two neighbors that ran the Ohio River line. Jonathan Walker, a sailor who freed slaves via steam lines, William Still, who wrote a book on the Underground Railroad, and Harriet Tubman, who helped hundreds of slaves escape, never losing one despite many dangers. However, despite all of these efforts, the movement ultimately failed. The institution of slavery would take the bloodshed of the Civil War to abolish it.
Abolitionists, despite their ultimate failure, still left a lasting legacy. They were a symbol for the world that people could stand up to wrong